Hello and welcome. These videos are based on the second edition RBT task list that's approved by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. My name is Lenice and I will be guiding you through section 14. In section 14, we will be discussing RBT task list item A5, enter data and update graphs. Within this section, our goals will be to 1, review why we do the work we do, 2, review the reasons for displaying data graphically, 3, review various types of graphs you may see as a registered behavior technician, 4, discuss data variability, level, and trend, as well as 5, introduce you to the practice of visual analysis data. At the Lovaas Center, we firmly believe in the intrinsic worth of every child. It is because of the children that we do this work. We appreciate their uniqueness and celebrate their progress, moment by moment, as well as years down the road. There has been a great deal of focus on some of the negative effects of autism, and far less talk about the positive aspects of children with autism. Many are gifted in certain areas, and some are extraordinarily intelligent. They just need help learning how to open up and truly blossom. You may have seen dramatic stories about children who suddenly and miraculously overcome the effects of autism. Unfortunately, these are rare cases. For the vast majority of children with autism, a return to more typical behavior, emotions, and social functioning comes gradually after years of intensive therapy. At the Lovaas Center, we have our mission and our vision clearly designed. Our mission is to deliver the highest quality evidence-based treatment to improve the lives of individuals and their families. And our mission is to empower people to reach their full potential. ABA is the practice of behavior analysis and using it to make significant changes in an individual's life that will be meaningful in their lives. In ABA, data drives all the decisions we make, and it is the foundation for making decisions regarding the client or student's treatment. Data is analyzed to inform the clinician whether progress is being made or not. We use the collected data to determine if a goal is mastered, when to switch or add new targets, or when to change teaching procedures to make greater progress. This information is collected and then reflected onto graphs. Graphs are visual tools we use to assess where our target behavior has been, where it is now, and where we can project it to go. Behavior analysts use several different methods to collect data. Some of the ways to collect behavioral data include frequency, rate, duration, fluency, and response latency. Frequency is the method referred to when the number of times that a target behavior is observed and counted. Example, Diego hit Cecile 5 times. Rate, same as frequency, but within a specified time limit. For example, Diego hit Cecile 5 times in 2 minutes. Duration is a measurement that refers to the amount of time that someone engaged in a behavior. For example, Evan had a tantrum for 42 minutes. Fluency is a measurement that refers to how quickly a learner can give responses within a period of time. For example, Randy read 15 sight words in 60 seconds. Response latency refers to the amount of time after a specific stimulus has been given before the target behavior occurs. For example, the teacher tells the class it's time to line up. The entire class lines up, and it takes Jimmy 2 minutes after the demand has been placed before he lines up with the rest of the class. Reminder that these are only a few common ways to measure behavior and does not represent an exhaustive list of measurements. As a registered behavior technician, you will be responsible for recording data throughout your therapy sessions. This data will then be accumulated in order to provide the BCBA with concise yet thorough information. They will use the data to track the progress of the interventions and analyze the treatment being provided to the client. The BCBA will then use the data to assist them in making clinical decisions regarding target behaviors. By displaying the data graphically, we're able to summarize the information and present it all at one time visually. This can help people on the team, such as parents, to get a better understanding of the process and current status of an intervention. Please take a look at the graph on your slide. We can quickly and easily see that there was a decrease in the targeted behavior. During the initial data collected at baseline, Tom was off task for approximately 25 to 30 intervals. The most current data reports that Tom is being off task during about 10 intervals. This shows that within 7 days of the intervention being implemented, Tom is off task a lot less of the time. The next step would be for the BCBA to review and evaluate the data and determine the next step. Okay, let's take a look at a line graph. As you can see on the slide, we have an example with several parts labeled. We'll go through each of the parts and their names of them and discuss more afterwards. B is the x-axis, C is the y-axis, D is labeled as a data point, E shows the data path, F is a condition line, G is the x-axis label, H is the y-axis label, and I are the condition labels. The total number of times the data is collected will be reflected in the x-axis. The data needs to be organized so that they reflect one number per unit. In this case, the x-axis is labeled as per session. The unit count of the observed behavior will reflect the y-axis. This can be the number of a behavior, number of time, number of behavior per unit of time, or a percentage. The baseline and intervention phases must be correctly labeled, and the data on either side of the condition line do not touch. On this slide, you can see different types of graphs that you may encounter as a registered behavior technician. The first graph is a line graph. This is the most popular and widely used in applied behavior analysis. Here, they graphed how many times a client ate a particular food during the course of 4 days. The second graph is a clustered bar graph. This graph is showing how many times this client ate a particular food during that week. This doesn't show the times per day, but instead shows an overall total for each food for the week. Another type of bar graph that is commonly used is a histogram. The third type displayed on this slide is a pie chart. Again, this is showing the overall total for each food for the week that the client consumed. Some other types of graphs that can be included are standard acceleration charts and scatter plots. In the world of data analysis, trend is one of the most important tools we use to interpret a graph. Trend is the trajectory or the overall direction taken by a data path. The way in which you find the trend is you connect the first and the last data point of the data set. People will typically say that the upward trend or the downward trend is being displayed when they're describing a graph. Trend is also used to determine the strength of an intervention. If the slope of the line is steep, then the intervention is working much more effectively. Variability is talking about how stable or unstable data points are within a set. When analyzing data patterns, it's important to look for a trend line first, and then use the trend line to identify if the most data points fall close to the trend line or not. Analysts will typically speak in terms of high or low variability. This too can be used to demonstrate the strength of an intervention. A solid, strong intervention will have a more stable data pattern, and if the data has a high variability, then something may not have been accounted for. The top graph has a low variability, whereas the intervention phase of the bottom graph has a high variability. Level is a line that represents the average of a set of data. It refers to the magnitude and direction of the change. The reason that level is so important when interpreting a graph is that level can show an indication that the intervention is effective. The level of the data relates to the position of the data set taken from the y-axis. An abrupt change in level in the right direction is an indication of the effectiveness of the intervention. Let's use the following graph as an example to analyze some data patterns. Terms that we often use when analyzing data are the terms gradually or rapidly, increasing or decreasing, stable or variable, or zero. When analyzing data, it's also typical to start by saying the trend first, then the variability, and last the level. Just because a graph has a clear trend does not mean that it's an effective intervention. For example, the graph in the slide has a very clear trend line. The data points also fall close to the trend line, so it's a stable data set. But think about the deficits of ASD, and think about the reason that we do what we do. Our goal is to improve socially significant behaviors. If a behavior of an individual was already increasing, then why would we have to intervene? Also, since the behavior was already increasing and we intervened, to what extent can we say that the increase was due to our intervention and not something that was already occurring in the client's life? It's important to look at trend, variability, and level to determine the strength of an intervention. Let's look at our first practice graph. Take a few moments to look at the graph and ask yourself several questions. Do you see an upward or downward trend? Does the data show stability or variability? Do you see a trend line? Was the intervention effective? In this graph, we see that during the baseline, there was a zero trend and high variability. And during the intervention phase, there's a zero trend and high variability as well. Neither phase demonstrate a clear trend. Both phases are widely variable, and when comparing both trend lines, it's plausible that the baseline phase has a slightly lower level line, but we need to do some calculations to be sure. In this case, the intervention is not effective at all. We're not sure what is causing the variability or even what the goal is in this graph. Here's our second example graph. Take a few minutes to look over it as we discuss some questions you should be thinking about. For this one, do you see an upward or downward trend? Is the data stable or variable? Is there a trend line? What's the level for this graph? And was the intervention effective? On this graph, we see that the baseline has a zero trend, but it's very stable. For the intervention, we see a zero trend line as well with stability, but also an increase in level. For this graph, the most important aspect to notice is the drastic change in level. This is definite proof that our intervention is effective. It was effective in increasing this particular behavior. There was no trend in either of the phases, and that's okay. The change in level does demonstrate that something in our intervention has changed the behavior, and both phases were stable. Here's our last example graph. As you look at this graph, ask yourself some of the same questions. Do you see an upward or downward trend? Is the data stable or variable? Is there a trend line? Is the intervention effective? Do you see any level changes? In this graph, we can see that there's gradually decreasing variable trend. It's a perfect demonstration to show that variability doesn't necessarily mean that the intervention is not effective. More often than not, our client's data will look like this for challenging behaviors.